Mr. Chairman, and everything that Senator Whitehouse said goes for Massachusetts as well. By extension, we are subject to all of the same threats that Rhode Island is subject to, and again, the most important environmental case thus far in our history, Massachusetts versus the EPA, is based on the erosion of the Massachusetts coastline, and by extension, Rhode Island. And they voted 5-4 to mandate that the EPA had to make an endangerment finding. So that's already been done. So we know this is happening, and we know that we have an absolute responsibility to ensure that we put in place the protective measures. So last year, Chairman Copper and I reintroduced the Green Streets Act, which would set goals to cut emissions from the national highway system and to help states protect the systems from unavoidable climate impacts. And we've got money for that already in Build Back Better, and we still have to work hard in order to get that passed. But there are already steps you can and should take under the climate title in the bipartisan bill that Senator Whitehouse was just referring to. So could you talk about those funds and the actions which you can take in order to ensure that we are dealing with the climate-related impacts?
Gladly, Senator. This is a major priority for us. It starts with the awareness that the transportation sector is the single biggest contributor of greenhouse gases in the U.S. economy. And I view that as a challenge for us to aspire to be the biggest part of the solution. The law that you have sent to us to implement is a major part of how we can do that. I'll point quickly to just a few elements in it that will help us meet that goal. One, of course, is the electric vehicle funding. We've already put out the guidance for $5 billion in formula funding to the states for charging infrastructure along highways. That'll be followed by $2.5 in competitive funding for community charging grants, all as part of getting that network of 500,000 EV chargers up. Then, of course, there's $7.3 billion in formula funding to states and another $1.4 in competitive grants over 5 years under the Protect program, recognizing the climate impacts that are upon us, no matter how effective we are at mitigating them. There's the carbon reduction program, $6.4 billion to specifically reduce transportation-related emissions. I will note, and unfortunately this is something I've had to repeat a few times in different regards in this testimony, we cannot fully implement this program either while under a continuing resolution because of the prohibition on new starts. Lastly, I'll just mention the $500 million Healthy Streets program, which allows for competitive grants to deploy cool and porous pavements and to expand tree cover. These unglamorous measures, I think, can make a big difference on things like heat islands, air quality, flood risks, and other impacts from our infrastructure development.
Yeah, and I agree with it. A lot of these companies, they have landscaping on the side of their truck as they pull up, but it's really land scraping. They just come in and just tear down the trees, tear down the green, and all of a sudden we get a beautiful new modern street in front of us, and there's just something that's been lost in our country in terms of valuing trees and all the role that can play. So I'd just like to come back to the community vehicle charging infrastructure aspect of the bipartisan infrastructure bill and what we're also going to be trying to do in the Build Back Better bill. And that is just to make sure that there's equity. So there's a lot of talk about making sure you can travel across the whole country with charging stations, but I think simultaneously it's imperative for us to focus upon communities, upon equity questions, on making sure that housing units and communities that probably aren't always thought of to be the first place where electric vehicles are going to be operating are also a part of this planning. So could you talk about that a little bit and how you're envisioning ensuring that while you can travel across the country and you can make your trip, that simultaneously people in the community that need these charges will also be given access.
Yes, thank you. The equitable access to electric vehicle charging infrastructure is a major priority, and I think it's one of the things we'll be able to support with that $2.5 billion for community charging. It's worth noting that lower income Americans would stand to benefit the most from the fuel and maintenance savings of EV ownership, provided, of course, that they could afford to purchase an EV. And there's pending legislation that might help on that front. Just a few days ago, I was in Colorado at an EV charging station at a public housing facility where there's an electric car share program. So I think it's a great example of how we can move out of the old view where EVs were regarded as a luxury item and recognize them as something that, with support from our policies, should be accessible to everybody.
No, thank you. My father was a truck driver, and you kind of get a job where your father worked. So I got a job driving a truck for 4 years. That's how I worked my way through college. But it was an ice cream truck, so I had to pull it into the driveway every night, jump out, and plug it into the side of the house. It took under 15 seconds every night. Now, my father hadn't thought it through because now his car can't be in the driveway. My ice cream truck is there. But nonetheless, if we think it through, and Malden is still a community in the bottom quartile of income in Massachusetts, with a plan for those kind of communities as well, I think people can adapt very easily. So I thank you for your leadership, Mr. Secretary. And by the way, I once again give you the invitation. I come up and see the Bourne and the Sagamore Bridge in Massachusetts.
I have not forgotten, and I would have been shocked if it didn't come up, Senator. Thank you.
And you will come?
You can count on it.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're pretty persistent, I would say that. You get an A for persistent. That's good. I think Senator Ernst is next. I think